Hello, everyone, and welcome to another experiment, if you will. I talk with people who have a very different of opinion on things than I do. This is a new series that I'm doing just to see where other people are in their heads and see if I can reason around whatever conclusions they've come to. And today I'm talking to Dr. Sy Garte. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, and he's a biochemist, a cancer researcher. Am I right?
Well, I'm a biochemist. I haven't done cancer research for a while, but I'm
Okay, I must have misread something online about you. Then I apologize. But anyway, what had happened was that he was, or you rather, were referred to me as someone who was a former atheist, now Christian, and the reason that you were tagged in the conversation that we had on Twitter was because of the description given, was that scientific evidence had driven you to Christianity, and we were going to talk about what conclusions or what actually changed your mind, because I'm always interested in that sort of thing, and I'll
Mhm.
clarify that in just a moment. Another reason that people were citing you, I just want to refer to something, and somebody had made a comment that scientists had no idea about anything about evolution or abiogenesis. So I wanted to make a reference. There was a number of people. There was a guy called Ricky Holtzclaw, I guess, known on Twitter as RDH_blue. And he wanted to accuse me of lying. This is what I want to start out with, just as I have a Christian scientist and the Christian community seeks to respect. He says I'm lying, that he says that evolution is a lie of Satan. Now, would you say that evolution is a lie of Satan?
No, I'm a pretty strict evolutionist.
Okay.
I've actually been mentioned in one of Richard Dawkins' books. So
Oh, well, very good, very good.
I'm there's no that's not something we need to even discuss.
Perhaps, but I just get weird about people calling me a liar.
Well, I don't like that either.
Anytime I disagree with somebody, that's the first accusation, is that I'm lying. Well, why would I lie? That doesn't even make any sense. So I mean, and so he then says that evolution is without basis or foundation, and he says some other things, but I'll just leave it at that. So you would say that evolution has a basis and foundation.
Oh, of course. I'll just say that I sometimes engage with atheists. More often, I engage with young Earth creationists, and when I do that, I probably sound like you,
Okay.
more or less. More or less, not completely.
All right. Well,
No, I don't have any. I don't think we're going to disagree on anything related to scientific fact, because I am a working scientist and I don't dispute the findings of science.
Okay.
And I've worked in evolution as well. So.
Yeah, it's something like I said, where they just say, well, that there's a lie from the pit of hell and all like this.
Yeah, they say that to me too. So
I'm glad you have some familiarity with that. Anyway, so
yeah.
I feel vindicated now. So you came to a conclusion, or you said that, and I'm going to ask you to just take over your explanation here in a moment. But as I understood, you said that you began to doubt, which I was a little confused at.
Right. So what happened was I was what I call I have the strong atheism position. The weak atheism position, which is what most people consider atheism, I call it the weak atheism, is don't believe in God. There's a stronger position, which is one does believe that God cannot exist, does not exist, religion is evil. And that was my view. That's the view of some atheists.
Well, that's actually my view, and if you don't mind,
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Since you brought it up, another thing that I wake up to today is immediately the criticism that somebody else has posted online that I don't know anything about philosophy, because I think that atheism is someone who does not believe in a God, when their philosophical definition is somebody who believes that God does not exist, and so that means that I'm ignorant. Again, yeah, I have to be ignorant or I have to be dishonest. It can't be that I'm just holding to the mainstream view promoted by American atheists and virtually every atheist in the country. It has to be that I'm ignorant or dishonest. Since he's my
Well,
dad.
so as I was saying, I didn't believe in a God, but I was further than that, and I really felt that God is an absurdity and an impossibility in a rational, reasonable universe, which we know is governed by natural law.
And since we hold that same position, or did,
No, yeah.
you would, why would you say, or why would you have said that God was impossible?
For all the reasons that you say, magic doesn't exist. There's no such thing as spirituality. There's no evidence for it. You know,
So you
when people
evidence,
say, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, my apologies. So
That's
you
all right.
found evidence that either magic or spiritualism, or not spiritualism, but I guess spirituality
Mm-hmm.
is an actual thing.
Well, here's what happened. I began, this was my belief through my 20s, college years, etc. I began learning a lot about science, and there were the belief that I had, and it wasn't a lack of belief, it was an actual belief that there could be no God, began to seem not terribly solid to me when I started learning some things about physics, things that I felt were just not rational. They didn't fit with the idea of a rational universe that made sense, that was easy to understand, or well, not easy, but at least, possible to understand. I had that crisis, I guess you could call it a crisis in faith in a way, when I started learning about quantum mechanics and the double slit experiment and observer effect and all these things, which are true. There's no question that they're true, but they left me wondering, how is all of this possible? And that kept growing when I began my graduate studies in biochemistry. Actually, after that, when we began working as a scientist, I began finding things that were just, not necessarily consonant with an easily understandable universe. I was not a believer. I now was at the point where I thought, okay, the universe is not rational. Fine. Okay, that's life. But
at what point did you find something irrational about the universe?
Well, for example, the universe, the basic structure of the universe is quantum mechanics. And it's very hard to understand the details of quantum mechanics. In other words, superposition and collapsing of wave functions and all that stuff. From a rational point of view, it seems as if when you do these experiments that photons are choosing which slot to go through once you look at them. And if you don't look at them, they don't choose or something. I'm trying to put this in, clearer terms. And everyone has said that this is not rational. I mean, Richard Feynman and the physicists, Niels Bohr with the Copenhagen interpretation have all said that this doesn't fit our concept of what we used to think was clearly a rational universe. And Einstein, of course, was kind of unhappy with the whole notion. And he said, something about it was spooky. And it was debated for quite a while until the evidence came in, and it was absolutely 100% solid that this was real. Hard to understand, but real.
What exactly was real?
The quantum mechanical the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, that you really do.
And by this, you're referring specifically what, to quantum fluctuations?
Well, to the observer effect, which I think is one of the more interesting issues. All of that is real. I mean, quantum fluctuations are real as well, but they're a result of these.
I'm just looking for the thing.
Stochastic, unpredictable, randomly generated events, which is part of the uncertainty principle, and all these other things that really rocked physics for the first part of the 20th century until people just realized they had to get used to it. There wasn't going to be any resolution in favor of reason or rationality.
Okay, so my take on that has been, that when you get into the very, very far back, or the very, very small down, I mean, you're going to get to like a limit to the reality, where at some point you're going to start to see the fabric that things are made of.
Right.
But no point ever would it imply. I mean, let me put this another way. I mean, there was a time when our ancestors believed that thunder and lightning and volcanoes were gods in action, that comets were an omen, stars and planets had human characteristics, epilepsy was a curse. I mean, diseases were witchcraft and all of that. Right. At no point were those the right answers.
Right.
That, there were things that we couldn't explain at that time.
Right.
And then when we gave up on the supernatural explanation and then found the real answers, well, in every one of those instances, the real explanation was a revelation of whole new fields of study,
right,
that were vastly more complex than the supernatural excuse we'd initially come up with. The supernatural excuse was still wrong.
Well,
and so my conclusion would be, I mean, if we ever discover what was the catalyst of the Big Bang, which I don't think it is possible to even do that, but if it were possible to discover the catalyst for the Big Bang, or every detail about some other aspect of science, like the origin of life or whatever, those things would also be, a whole new field of study previously unimagined. And
but here's
render the idea of a God even more ridiculous than our current studies have already shown that idea to be.
Okay, so you left a little bit out of the history of the scientific approach. The first part of the scientific revolution was the statement by Francis Bacon and then others that you could actually come up with knowledge that was new. You didn't have to refer to the ancient wisdom of the Greeks or whoever. That was an extremely controversial and revolutionary idea at the time, but it worked. And so the scientific revolution eventually took hold. And it took hold largely because scientists who were studying the planets, Kepler and Copernicus and all the early scientists in astronomy, and then later in just physics, Newton, etc., had faith that there would be a rational answer for all the questions they were looking into, and they proved themselves right. I mean, it's really was remarkable that Newton's equations of motion work. They're fairly simple equations, and they actually describe the real world. So that was an amazing breakthrough. And after that, science really took over, and there was a pretty strong agreement within the entire scientific community until the end of the 19th century that the world and the universe was quite rational, and we could understand it, and we could model it with mathematical equations. And there wasn't that much left to do. There was only one pesky little problem, which was nobody understood the speed of light, which turned out to change everything, of course, because by the beginning of the 20th century, Einstein just killed that idea eventually. And then quantum mechanics as well. So with relativity and quantum mechanics, physics found itself saying things that were still correct, still accurate, no God involved here, I haven't gotten to that yet, but we're no longer rational, reasonable, and I mean, easy to follow the way Newtonian physics had been, or Maxwell's physics, the earlier physics. So that realization had an effect on me to put a big crack in my proactive, strong atheist belief. Not that I believed there was a God, but that I believed that rationalism is not the thing that one should believe in. The universe is, as you just said, the universe is far more complex that can be easily rationally understood by us human beings. There's some real complexity, yes, but just more than complexity. It's just stuff that we can't grasp.
So
and that, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm done. I'm done.
Well, very often, of course, I mean, the thing that I argue with is creationists all the time. So, I mean, they always want they want to say that, if you can't explain you have to explain the origin of the universe in order to deny our taxonomic classification as apes, as if there's a relation between these two things. And I try to tell people that it doesn't matter how the universe began. You're still evolving. You're still an ape. But when we're talking about the Big Bang, I mean, I'm looking at, when they talk about the fabric of the universe, and I have this thing where I understand that the universe or gravity is a bend in the fabric of space-time, and obviously black holes are supposed to be a super dense gravity, which actually punch a hole in the fabric of space-time. And if that's the case, then having the entirety of the cosmos compressed into a singularity would, of course, be a rift in the time-space continuum itself. And when you begin to talk like Star Trek or Dr. Sy, it does throw people off like this.
Yeah.
But at no point does it. I mean, how do I put this? If we're going into this realm of Dr. Whovian's Star Trek type of tech talk to describe the fabric of the universe, there's just not a connection between that and going wholly the other way.
Yeah,
I
agree.
The most childish and most simplistic excuse men have ever made up to explain anything, which is magic anthropomorphic immortals. That a guy says, "Let there be everything," and does an incantation spell to poof everything out of nothing.
Okay, so, and in fact, I did not become a believer when I began this period of uncertainty about rationalism, and eventually being convinced that rationalism is not the answer. Instead, I was more convinced than ever that science, including the science of the new physics, and later, as I was working in it, the science of the new molecular biology, that those scientific fields are the way to discover how the universe works, how it's put together, and how it works. And I was a scientist, so I felt great. And I still feel that way, by the way. What I now feel, however, and this is the part you will not like, is that I don't believe in God because of the gaps in our knowledge. I agree that it's very likely we may fill all of those gaps in knowledge. Possibly even the origin of the Big Bang, although like you, I doubt it, because physicists don't seem to want to do that or be able to do it. But and origin of life is another one. It's a toughie, and we can talk about it in more detail later, but I do not deny that it's possible that there's some way for chemical evolution to have started life on Earth. I think it's unlikely, but I don't think it's impossible. So it's not because of what we don't know that I believe in God. It's because of what we do know about the universe that I believe in God.
On what you describe as chemical evolution, you said that I made a very good video explaining abiogenesis to middle school students.
Yeah.
And there doesn't seem to me to be that much we know a substantial amount, enough certainly to know that it happened. Even if we don't have all the details, we certainly have a lot of them. So
yeah, but we don't have. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There are some things in the replication or in the catalysts that I agree. There's still some things to work out, but you don't have to work out absolutely everything to know that this happened.
Right. So here is what stops me, and I know plenty of Christians who don't agree with me, who believe that there's no problem with getting chemical evolution to life. And of course, many others who say it's absolutely impossible.
I would prefer not to call it chemical evolution, because then it seems like we're giving credence to something Kent Hovind wrote. I mean, we're talking about abiogenesis.
Okay, so in abiogenesis, there is a big problem which you couldn't discuss in the video for middle school students. But to me, the big problem is the origin of evolution, because evolution, as we know it, requires a very specific biochemical mechanism, which is the translation process, where the genetic code informs the ribosome and all the enzymes involved to make specific proteins, and that's what allows evolution to proceed. Because if you don't have a really good link between genotype and phenotype, then evolution can't work, because you need to have the target of selection, which is the phenotype, has to come from a very close linkage of the genotype, which is what gets inherited. So that's necessary. Now, that could have evolved to some extent, but what I don't get is, how do you evolve a system which is in charge of evolution?
Okay, well,
I'm not saying it's impossible,
when
but
we talk about, just for the sake of layman, we
okay.
seem to be, in the course of this conversation, when you're talking about the beginning of life and the emergence of the first genetic material and so forth, we do seem to have a couple of different contexts, because one definition of evolution would be descent with inherent genetic modification, and so you
Right.
have to have genes to start with, and so
Exactly.
the translocation and everything, that all has to be underway. Now, another context of evolution, being a more simplistic one, change over time, doesn't really apply here, and that confuses a lot of people, because there was a point in our taxonomy where people will say, well, you think we came from bacteria, and while technically at some point there were the only molecules that were alive on this planet were bacterial, you couldn't say that we evolved from them in the same sense, because it wasn't an ancestor-descendant relationship. Maybe this is only important to me, but I don't want people to think that horizontal gene transfer is the same thing as evolution. So I just throw that clarification out there. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that problem is a big problem, and I think there is good evidence. It's not really evidence. It's really good theories that there was a form of life before the kind of life we know, which is based on DNA and proteins, and that form of life was based on RNA, the RNA world idea, and that has some logic, because RNA can form catalysts like proteins, and it also can replicate. Doesn't do either one very well, but it's possible. So that's the consensus theory in the field, as far as we can go, as to how molecular biology began. The problem is there are many, many technical issues with even getting an RNA world, and there's no way to see how an RNA world can evolve, because you have, and this gets very technical, and I don't have to go into the detail, but you have so many different ribozymes in one cell. How do you get evolution there? It's not one molecule like a DNA strand. So there are problems. There are problems in how you get to RNA world, and how you go from RNA world to modern life, which is all the same, by the way, all from bacteria to us. Those mechanisms are all the same. So we know that there was a common ancestor. We call him Luca, last universal common ancestor. And we can't go much back before Luca. When we do that, we're in the realm of hypothesis.
Now, are you talking about, when you mean Luca, are you referring also to prokaryotes and eukaryotes together?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, because
this is actually before the split from prokaryotes to eukaryotes.
Okay.
But we know,
I look at it a little differently with the endosymbiosis that led to.
Oh yeah, that came later. Yeah, that came later. So the Luca is well characterized, because it contains those features that are present in every cell on the planet, and as far as we know, have always been present in all cells on the planet. And those features include DNA, they include ribosomes, they include a translation system, they include a number of very specific enzymes that must be there, a membrane, certainly. Okay, that's Luca. We don't know how we got to Luca, and we might find out. I'm not saying that that's impossible. But it's not going to involve what we know as evolution, because it doesn't. You can't.
Well, adding to what you're saying, I mean, when you're talking about the Luca for prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and I have a different place. I begin at a slightly later position.
Well, that's okay.
It's not an evolutionary process. The endosymbiosis, where
Right.
eukaryotic cells envelop rickettsia bacteria to then convert that into mitochondria.
Right.
I mean, these are not evolutionary processes. There
No.
are different processes at work. But just because it's not an evolutionary process, or because it's an unexpected process, or even a complex process, I don't see And I understand you said you don't believe what you do because of the gaps. So it wouldn't be fair to say, well, I don't understand how to explain this, so I'm just going to throw up my hands and say that it was magic, which is what so many other people do. And they do the logical fallacy that if you can't explain it, therefore God, which God is not an explanation. That's just an excuse. That's just a default for
it's a big mistake for Christians to do that, and I'll just say that to any Christian who might be watching this. The mistake to do that is if you base your faith, your belief in God and Christ on a gap of knowledge, what happens when that gap gets filled?
Exactly.
What do? You say, oh, well, I was wrong, and you walk away from the church. And gaps have been continually being filled. So, you have to be very careful about that.
And I would just like to add one more thing. Another argument that I frequently have dealing with creationists is trying to get them to understand that whether God exists or not, evolution is still a thing, that we can still prove that's real.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Now,
I actually see evolution, and I say this to other Christians, as one of the great majestic works of God. Because if you think about how evolution works, it's beautiful. People talk about intelligent design as, God designed something and made it. Well, that's kind of like what a smart person would do. Maybe not even a smart person, maybe just a regular person. God is not an intelligent designer. He's not an engineer. What I believe is that, like so much of the universe, when it came to life, we have this amazing system of evolution which is able to generate so much diversity. It's able to generate us from think about where we came from a batch of chemicals. Is he agreeing with me or you?
I'm sorry. There's in the house, the dog's going off. And I apologize for that.
That's all right. I thought maybe he heard about evolution and he decided, yeah, that's where I come.
No, it goes with what I've tried to explain to a number of people. I mean, which is a better example of intelligent design? Somebody who magics up each individual species, or somebody who devises like a Mandelbrot sort of program that takes care of all of it itself. So it's an automated system.
I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm with you. That, to me, it's not proof of God, of course. We'll get to that in a minute, but that's an indication of something wonderful, and I'm happy to call it God. And many people see that. I'm not alone, by the way. There's a whole group of Christians called evolutionary creationists. There's a foundation called the Biologos Foundation, which I would certainly recommend everybody look at. It was started by Francis Collins. It's now has a website, and they hold the same views I have. And there are many other people within the Christian community and within the scientific community who are Christians who agree with this. And it takes nothing away from our basic fundamental beliefs in Christianity.
Okay, well, that gets a whole other topic, and before we can get to Christianity, we have to get to a God, and I think before we can get to a God, we have to get to supernatural.
Okay.
So, and supernatural, for people to understand, and I appreciate that you called it magic earlier. This is any of the explanations that we gave before about epilepsy being a demonic possession, or diseases being witchcraft, or comets being an omen, or any of those sorts of supernatural explanations. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything supernatural is literally magic, but supernatural explanations of the kind that I just mentioned would all be categorized as magic. Yeah. So that's the way I refer to it. So we have to have this supernatural or miraculous sort of, and miracles are the same thing as magic too. So we still have to have that supernatural aspect of the universe. Where did we get any indication of that?
Okay. So I'm not going to go through all the history. I'm sorry. I'm not hearing you.
I'm sorry. It's okay. Go ahead.
All right. What I believe at this point is that, and as I said, I came to it gradually, is that once I was able to see that the universe did not have to follow super rational rules. It certainly did not. And that there was a tremendous amount of layered complexity. I also began looking at a number of other things that were still within the realm of science, such as emergence. I mean, emergence is a phenomenon that has a name, but it's not understood, and it cannot be explained. I don't think that will ever be explained. It's one of those things. I mean, one of the things that science tells us is that
I'm a little surprised. I'm a little surprised that you would say that emergence cannot be explained.
Well, correct me. I mean, why? Do you know an explanation?
I'm sorry?
What would be the explanation for emergence?
Which aspect of emergence is unexplained?
Well, by definition, emergence is a phenomenon that comes out of usually a level of a complexity of components that gets to the point where a new property develops that is not explained, that is not explainable by the properties of the components. So, for example, the famous example that everybody uses, it's on Wiki, it's everywhere, is water. Okay, water has properties. Some of those properties are explainable by the molecular structure of water, but some of them are not. And when you go from physics to chemistry, when you go from wave equations to molecular bonding and molecular shapes of molecules, the same thing happens. When we go from chemistry to life, the same thing happens. I mean, one of the things that happens, how do you know when something's alive? Well, it seems alive. It has certain properties, but those properties, which include everything we know in living cells, even though we know how they function, that phase transition, which is usually what's used to describe emergence, is unclear how that could possibly be. How could it be that at some point these atoms and molecules just took on new dimensions?
For the aid of people who are, any creationists again who might be watching, emergence is another issue that when you're arguing with creationism, because everybody wants things to be administered from the top down, and emergence is the emergence or emergent complexity or properties that come from building a system with very simple rules and then turning it on, and then that system produces brilliant detail from the bottom up out of all the many increments.
It can, but it's also possible in many cases, and this has been elaborated by a physicist named George Ellis, who's written a couple of books about this, and frankly, it's way over my head, but he uses the term top down as opposed to bottom up to explain emergence and complexity. Now, he's not even talking.
If we're talking about emergence, we are talking about, the very many smallest increments culminating into larger patterns made of all of them.
I mean, that could be one definition, but that's not what I'm talking about. Okay. I'm talking about, and you can see it in everyday life. There are examples all over the place where you get small increments, and then it's like a tipping point, and all of a sudden, and that's why it's called a phase transition. It's like when water gets cooler and cooler and cooler, and then you have ice, okay, or when ice melts. So that a phase transition is when the components change little by little, and they reach a specific point of whatever it is. And in most cases, you can call it complexity, where a whole new property, quote, emerges unexpectedly. It's a little bit related to chaos theory, where if you have one of the constants at a certain value, you get nice regular patterns, and then you raise it just a tiny bit, you get chaos. So all of this is, I think, something that has to be taken into account when we try to understand the universe. And at the same time that all of this was happening, one of the reasons that I had rejected theism completely was that I felt there was no evidence for it. As I learned more about science, I began to understand and realize that there actually is a very large difference between evidence and proof. I saw one of your, I think I heard actually you say to somebody on one of your earlier interviews, and I may have misheard, that proof and evidence are the same thing. Well, I'm not hearing you.
Sorry. I also have a parrot in the background who has been making an awful lot of noise. So I keep muting when I'm not talking. And then, of course, forget to turn that back on. But what I was going to say, the definition that I use for proof, obviously, I'm not going to be using mathematical proof. We would never be able to prove anything outside of mathematics if I'm going to stick with that. Okay. I use the term you would more likely hear in a courtroom, where it's an overwhelming preponderance of evidence. Proof is an overwhelming preponderance of evidence, then proof is literally made of evidence.
Proof is made of
different things. Yeah.
Well, no, but not everything that's evidence is proof. I mean, that's something every scientist knows.
It would have to be the criteria of overwhelming preponderance and all that.
That's right. That's right. And eventually, I mean, when you get enough evidence for something, for a proposition, and you have no evidence against it, which is critical, then you can say you've proved it. But you have to have both.
And again, the creationists watching will demand that it be 100% proof. Because why the double standard? Why do you have a belief that is based on absolutely nothing at all, yet you demand that you have to have 100% convicted? No, it's not that way. So it's proof beyond reasonable doubt.
Well, right. And the reasonable, I mean, I had a professor once who I think he was quoting someone else, but he said a great line: an ugly single fact can kill a beautiful hypothesis. And that's true.
I think there's been a few people in the last few hundred years that have said
that. I think it's an old quote, but the first time I heard it, and that's true. I mean, you can't say you found some truth if you have pretty strong evidence, even if it's a small piece of evidence that's against it. And one of the other things that you learn when you're doing science, if you don't learn it in school, you certainly learn when you start doing it, is that it's very, very hard to be sure about anything. If you look at any scientific paper published, you will never see the word proof mentioned. And what you will see is at least a paragraph somewhere in the conclusions that, even if it's an incredibly brilliant paper, I think I know one exception, which is Watson and Crick's paper. But other than that, there's always a paragraph that has to say, our results might not be correct, or our conclusion might not be correct because there's another way to interpret this result, or we might have made some mistakes, or we might have done. In other words, you have to have a degree of uncertainty in your paper, or you will not get it published.
Well, there's also another thing that, again, the creationists watching this will not understand. Uncertainty equates to honesty.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm assuming honesty.
Well, no. I have to explain this because, I mean, there's a lot of people that don't understand that that it is dishonest to say that you know something that you don't actually know.
Exactly, and that was exactly the position I found myself in as a strong atheist. I felt it was dishonest to say I am certain there is no God, because it applies to any position. It applies to the idea that there is a God, and it applies to the idea that there is no God.
Understanding that in order, you get that it's not possible for a cow to jump over the moon, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I've argued with scientists who refuse to say that anything is impossible. I mean, fortunately, I haven't argued with many of them. But well, the chances of that are very slim. No, there's no chance, period, that a cow is going to be able to develop the trajectory in the in the length of their legs and the force of the muscles to jump over. There's not that's impossible.
You cannot violate the second law of thermodynamics.
It's not just improbable by the measures.
Right.
No, that sometimes you have to break your personal little code and realize that some things are impossible.
Right.
And I forget where I was going to go with this. Damn it.
Well, we agree on that, and I was talking about the idea of uncertainty.
Well, again, yeah. So the idea that before you can say that something is possible, you have to be able to show that a possibility exists.
Right.
You know, how much pounds per square inch can these legs produce? You know, how much trajectory do they have? What kind of a speed can you gather in the distance given? So forth. You have to be able to show that possibility exists.
So okay.
And so when we're talking about a God, where do we show that possibility?
Okay, that's a very good question. So now we get into the thing that really, in science, that really rocked me. And that was, and you've heard about this many times, and you've talked about how it's not an issue, but let me put it in a slightly different way, I think, than you might have talked about it before. I'm talking about the fine-tuning of the constants. It's not just the cosmological constants. One of the things that science cannot do, and that's another subject we have to get into, is the limits of science. But one of the things that science cannot do, it has no theory for it, and nobody's working on it, is to explain where any constant in a physical law comes from. Because physical laws are models of reality, and the models only work when we put in constants like Planck's constant or Avogadro's number or the cosmological constant, the gravitational constant. We don't know where those numbers came from. And it happens, people have found, and there's no debate about this, that some of those constants, like the strength of the strong force, have to be pretty close to what they are, or we wouldn't have stars, or we wouldn't have carbon.
Yeah, I would say that it's fair that they would have to be pretty close to what they are. The way the creationists represent that argument is extreme, and I've dealt with several people talking about the infinitesimally small degree that something cannot vary, which in their minds somehow implies that this incomprehensibly vast waste of space in which we will survive everywhere but the skin of this one rock was somehow designed with us in mind. Obviously, that can't be the real answer.
Well, we don't know that.
We don't know that. If we're talking about an intelligent designer, we're talking about somebody who really knows how to waste space.
Well, why is that? No, this doesn't preclude living organisms in any other planet. It precludes, because the laws are the same everywhere. So there could be life on Mars.
We're talking about a universe that was created for us.
Yes, exactly.
So
but that's not the only possibility. There's enough.
Okay, my audience isn't looking at further possibilities. I deal with creationists. Okay.
Okay. Well, hold on. I'm going to get there. I can only see three possibilities for the fine-tuning argument. One is the creationist argument that God designed the universe to have stars, planets, life, humans, maybe on this planet, maybe on many planets, but to have life that could eventually worship him. Now that's a theistic argument. The other argument, which is not theistic, is that, yeah, it's not a big deal that we have those constants. They're the way they are because we're here and we're alive and we see them. And in our universe, the constants are this way, but we actually live in a multiverse with many, many other universes, billions and trillions. And in those universes, the laws are different. So we just happen to be living in the one that's right. Okay, that's
well, to be fair, the only reason we're having the conversation is because we live in a universe in which we can exist.
Exactly. So those are the two main. There's one third possibility, which I think is much less likely, just because there doesn't seem to be has not been any progress in it for a long time, and that is that there will be a physical theory that will explain all of these constants. Some people think string theory will do that, but actually string theory explains everything, so it doesn't really explain anything. But at this point, I think that the two best alternatives are the multiverse, or that God created the universe to be designed for us, the one you said.
On the idea of a multiverse as an explained theory, is it necessary for a multiverse? I mean, what does that explain?
Well, that explains the statistical impossibility of having only one universe that by chance came out perfect. That's
I personally imagine that. I mean that and I say imagine, but I mean this is a fair way to put it. If there is a universe, then we could have universes popping into existence like bubbles in the bottom of a saucepan coming to boil. Right? There could be an infinite number of them.
That's the point.
Really matter. doesn't really impact the fact that we live in one of those where we are within the constraints in which life can exist. And there may be many universes where that's possible. There may not be that many. Doesn't really matter. Doesn't have an impact over the fact that, okay, so coincidentally, obviously,
yeah,
we live in a universe in which we can't exist.
Right. So then the only question, I'm sorry. I agree. I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make, that is a rational possibility as an argument for why the constants are fine-tuned in our universe. Yeah. If you exclude any other universes, that this is the only, there are no bubbles, there are no other reasons to have a multiverse, and multiverse is quite popular with physicists now, but this being one reason. If you exclude that, you're left with an impossibility unless those are designed, because people talk about the statistics, but sometimes it's gotten wrong.
The reason you bring up the multiverse is because, I guess, to show probabilities.
Yeah, it's the only alternative. It's
okay.
Frankly the
as
only
I said, I suspect there probably are. There could be multiple universes, but it doesn't really matter from my perspective. So getting back to in my perspective, you said that the alternate is this thing that is not possible, that a God, that it cannot exist, who is in our image, even though he predates the things we evolved from, which is another problem, that he's going to magic up with an incantation spell people who can then worship him. So we've begun a string of contradictions. Things that don't make sense.
Well, yeah, the way you phrase them, they don't make sense. But let me go back a little.
I try to be as courteous as I possibly can here. I don't think you can phrase that in a way that makes sense either.
Well, let me try.
Okay.
The multiverse and the God hypothesis have one thing in common. We can never prove either one. And the reason for that is other universes that are outside of our universe cannot be explored, cannot be known or unknown. God is outside of our universe. It's the only way he could possibly have created this universe. And he cannot be known or explored.
Okay, so if, again, we're talking about somebody who lives outside of our reality, then he does not exist in reality.
Well, he exists within reality if we assume that the universe is his creation.
So he's both outside reality and inside reality.
Let me finish.
Okay.
God is the creator of the universe. And I don't know whether God, and now I'm talking about before I became a Christian, when I started thinking about how God might be, I was completely confused because of what you just said. I don't know whether God is out there and made the universe and is still out there and never comes in, or whether, as the Christians were saying, he made the universe and now he shows up and he does things and he makes miracles.
And when he shows up to do things, he shows up to do inept things, where he creates people and then has to kill them all because he realized he made a mistake and has to drown everybody in a flood that we know didn't happen, and can then be bargained down by a Stone Age sheep herder who says, well, what if there's 10 people in the city? What if there's 5? Do I hear 3?
Aaron, this may come as a terrible shock to you, but I'm not a biblicist.
Granted, but so this goes back to what I said before, but is it regardless whether God exists or not, evolution is still true, and the Bible is still false. Either way.
Well, the Old Testament, I think, is a book that is fascinating. It is not to be taken literally. The only people who take it literally are young earth creationists and extreme atheists.
But they will also
historically,
they will also cite Jesus saying that you have to follow every jot and tittle of those old Mosaic laws. So you have to keep the Feast of the Leavened Bread and keep the Feast of Weeks and all of those traditions nobody follows anymore.
No.
But those are things you're supposed to adhere to.
Yeah, well, the theology gets a little more complex than that, but the point is that the Old Testament to me is not something that I base anything on, except I like to read it. There's some beautiful stuff in it. I skip the bad stuff because I don't like it. I don't have to tell you about the bad stuff. You already know. When I get to the New Testament, and this is what I'm getting to, is the whole picture became clear to me when I considered the idea that Jesus Christ was God incarnate. And this was God coming to earth for a purpose, to tell humanity where they're going wrong, what they need to do, and how they have to behave, and how they have to act, and what they should believe.
Then
And
why didn't he do that? Any of those things?
Jesus?
Why didn't he do any of those things then? If that was his purpose.
Why didn't Christ do any of the things?
Yeah,
that's what he
just
did.
listed.
He preached. He preached love. He preached
that
brotherhood between people.
He preached that you have to forsake your own families to follow him, because he's come to divide, husbands from their wives, and parents from their children, and so forth. And that you can't be his disciple unless you hate your mother and your father and your sister and your brother, and so forth.
Okay, I think that's a little bit of an
and that you have to, the only way to get to the Jewish Father God is through Jesus. And Jesus always, only, ever, consistently describes himself as separate from God. That God is somewhere else, it's someone else, somewhere else, who knows things Jesus doesn't know. So Jesus is not saying that he's the physical incarnation of God. Krishna described himself as the physical incarnation of God, but Jesus did not.
No, he did not. I agree.
So I don't want to get into theology, because honestly,
yeah, it's a good idea, because I'm not good at it.
Okay. I don't want to get into theology, because we could spend a week on that easily, and there will never be a time. You could show that a God exists, and you're never going to be able to give a word of defense for Christianity. Christianity is just wrong. There's no defense for it at all. So let's get back to the more general kind of concept.
Yeah, okay. So why I brought it up is because I wanted to explain that the general God concept is difficult. I found it very difficult to believe in God. There was a point where I thought maybe that would be a thing worth doing, and I couldn't do it until I discovered Christ. And then I found it not only easier, but I found it cohesive and coherent. But I still
discover Christ.
Let me finish. Okay. But I didn't, even though I found it more coherent, more interesting. I read the Gospels. I thought, wow, this is interesting. Nice idea. But I still didn't believe. And but I was moving in that direction. And what it took for me to believe was a series of things, including going to a church for the first time ever in my 40s. I'd never been in a church before. And hearing stuff this was a Catholic church, actually, from the priest, which I was completely surprised at hearing. It was, I expected, what I'd always heard about in churches, which was, sinners and brimstone, and don't do this and don't do that, and you're horrible. Instead, I heard only messages of love, which I was very surprised about. And that was love.
Especially from a Catholic church.
Well, I was surprised. I was. And I went back several times. And at a certain point, I began to feel that I was being called by Christ. And then when I thought about things, I realized that had actually been happening a lot. And I just was ignoring it, or saying, I ate something bad for dinner, indigestion, whatever. It's not a real thing. I had emotional reactions to things, and I just decided that was just emotional reactions to things. It was nothing real. But I had a few experiences that were very, very powerful, which you'll hear from almost all Christians who convert to Christianity. And after those experiences, I began thinking, well, maybe I could actually believe in this. Maybe it's actually real. And I still resisted for some time. And when I finally stopped resisting, which happened on one particular day, and I decided, and I realized that I actually had become a believer, everything made sense. I was filled with a sense of joy that you hear about. Everything else made sense. I didn't lose one single part of my scientific worldview. In fact, if anything, it became clearer, more meaningful. And I've been that way ever since. It hasn't been that long. It's been about 10, 12 years.
Okay, so the advantage that I had
please.
when I went through the same experience, I mean, I did the reborn Christianity thing
Mhm.
at 19,
Mhm.
and I remember the thing that saved me from that rather abruptly was when I asked a friend of mine who then, we were just, just teenage kids, but later as adults, he became a ordained Southern Baptist minister running a fundamentalist young earth Christian school.
Mhm.
And I asked him, how do I know that this euphoria is really Jesus and not just, some illusion of my own
Right.
manufacture?
Right.
And he grabbed me by both shoulders with a huge beaming smile and told me, just keep telling yourself it's Jesus until you believe it.
Okay.
And that was so grotesquely dishonest
Mhm.
that it was my last instant as a Christian. It broke me out of Christianity that fast.
If it had me, I wouldn't have said that. And in fact, I have not. I've talked to people in that position.
Yeah,
and
now the
I've
problem
said,
I have with churches, as we mentioned before, with that it is dishonest to pretend that you know things you don't know.
right.
I can know things that I know for the creationists that are watching. If I say that I know something, it means that I can show you that I know it. It means that I can actually prove that I actually do know this thing, and that you don't have to know everything in order to know anything.
Right.
People who criticize my ineptitude in philosophy always make these kinds of points that you have to know everything before you can know anything. It's another absurdity.
No, that's not true.
Yeah, but the only value information has for me is however accurate you can show it to be. And if you can't show that it is accurate at all, then it has no value at all. And so when I go to church, the best I can hope for in a church is that they're going to be asserting baseless speculation as though it were fact. Talking in detail about what they pretend to know that they really don't know. That's the best that I can get.
Well, you see, I had a different experience. When I began thinking that I might be a Christian, I talked to priests. I went to a priest and I said, I think I don't know. I'm not sure. And I had a lot of problems. I told him, this whole idea of the Trinity makes no sense to me. You got to explain that.
And not just to you. It literally doesn't.
Well, yeah, it doesn't make sense. In fact, it didn't make sense.
And you know why it doesn't make sense?
Wait, can I finish this?
I'm sorry.
He said to me, it doesn't make sense to me either.
Yeah.
And I said, what? He said, it's a mystery and we don't know everything. And when I heard that, I said, I'm willing to go further now. And I'll tell you why. I'm going to tell you a little story, if I may, about science, nothing to do with this.
Okay.
One time I went to a seminar when I was in one of the universities. I went to a seminar by another scientist who happened to be friends with a guy I went to the seminar with, who was sitting next to me. And I heard the talk. He showed a lot of slides. He had a hypothesis. He showed that all his experiments worked and the hypothesis was really supported. And not only that, but then he did some other things. I don't remember the details, but everything was incredibly strong and powerful evidence. And I turned to my friend and I said, what's going on? What happened to him? And my friend said, oh, you didn't hear? He got a contract with a drug company. Why did I feel that way? Why was I confirmed by what my friend said? Because this guy was sure of his answers, and no scientist ever is. If you hear a talk, and people have often asked me, I hear different scientists saying different things about stuff. Which one is correct? And I always say, the one who says he's got all the answers and everything fits, like a conspiracy theory, is wrong. It's wrong. So when you have a conspiracy theory like 9/11, right? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Oh gosh, I haven't heard of that one.
Oh, you have? Okay. So, if you watch that horrible movie, Small Change, and you listen to these people, everything fits. It all fits perfectly. And if it doesn't fit, they make it fit. So the story is incredibly perfect. Yeah. And that is not science. That's the opposite of science. In other words, doubt, uncertainty is built into true knowledge. So the fact that I am not certain about lots of stuff in Christianity does not bother me. It makes me feel that it's real.
Okay. For what I've got from what we've had so far, there's nothing, there will be nothing that will ever imply Christianity. There's too much wrong with that. Theologically, there are so many failures with that there's no possible way to defend that anymore. That's gone. If something has already been disproved, it can't be revived. On the bigger thing, which would actually be the more important thing. I mean, if you proved that there was a God, it would not be the Christian God. If a God existed, it would be a different God, and Christianity would still be a false religion.
That you're free to have that view. I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not trying to convince you otherwise.
I'm just saying the theological problems are so insurmountable.
Okay.
That's the problem. The problem with Christian theology is what renders it impossible. But
theology theology is very, very subject to personal views and interpretations of things.
Well, of course, theology is often described, and I'm amused at this. It's described as the study of the nature of God and of belief. But there is no nature of God, because there's not a single fact that anyone can verify or falsify. So there's literally nothing anyone can start from to study in the first place.
But then you just said that theology of Christianity is bad. It can't work. So you're saying that there is a theology that's real.
No, yes, there's a theology, and
you just don't think it works. You don't think it explains anything.
Yes, theology is supposedly the study of the nature of God and of belief. But the definition has a problem, because you literally can't study God. If there's nothing at all that you can verify or falsify, that you have literally no fact. If there's not a single fact that you can start from, there's literally nothing you can know about it either. So you have to remove the nature of God from the theology. The theology then becomes nothing more than a study of beliefs made up by men. So then theology becomes a doctorate in mythology. It's the same thing. It's the reason that people say that having a doctorate in theology is similar to having a PhD in Mother Goose. It's just the beliefs that people made up. And that's all that it is. So, I mean, here's a funny thing, just to give you an idea. I'm at this seminary school, and this very arrogant and superior theologian, he describes himself as a serious theologian. And I couldn't believe this guy. Wait, how can you imagine serious theologian? That means you study made up stories, and that's it.
But you're assuming that the stories are made up. How do you know that? How do you know?
You have to admit that there's an awful lot of religions out there, and even if you think that yours is the one true faith, and that yours is the personal relationship, and that everybody else claiming the same thing is just crazy, and that all of those other religions are made up, you admit that all those other religions are made up.
No, I don't. I knew that would shock you. I don't know that Christianity is the true religion. Remember, I don't know if I told you this.
That's irrelevant to what I was saying, though. It means that even if yours is the true belief,
right? Okay.
We're going to hold that Hinduism and a number of others are all made up.
Okay.
So it's not an assumption that they're made up. I mean, we know that these people are composing these stories. We know how Joseph Smith, for example, composed the Book of Mormon and so forth. Right. The religions are made up.
Some are. I think that there is a inherent desire for people to understand something about the world, which explains the scientific urge, and to understand something about what's beyond the world, the supernatural world. And that seems to be something that's inherently human. And you could ask the question, okay, does this mean that it's, I don't know, just fake? It could be, but it could also be that this characteristic of human beings was instilled in us by God, because he wants us to be in relationship with him. That's something that we do know. Go ahead.
If God wanted us to be in a relationship, then he's not a very intelligent designer. and
we don't know that.
He clearly doesn't know how to go about his plan.
We don't know that.
He doesn't seem to know what the basics, the fundamentals of a relationship even are.
You know, it's interesting because I've heard many people, many atheists, but not all atheists and not only atheists, say that humans are arrogant and consider themselves to be special, and in fact, we're not really any more special than most animals. But what's interesting is that the argument that you're making now is suggesting that we can understand the nature of God, who is, that's very arrogant. Why should we be able to, we don't even understand the basics of quantum mechanics. Why would we understand the nature of God? Who by definition created the universe, which means he must be much more complicated, much more complex, much more difficult to understand than the universe. So
well, I can think hypothetically about this super complex God.
Yeah, when we say what a bad designer, why didn't he do this? Why didn't he do that? Why did he make us this way? That's kind of like, you know, an ant looking up at us and saying, you know, why do they have such big feet? I mean, we can't understand the nature of God. You're right about that. That's why Jesus Christ came to earth and told us, God is real. My Father is real. The way to him is through me, as you said.
And Jesus also said a whole lot of things that showed that he didn't know what he was talking about.
That's your interpretation, but I remember I did see what you wrote about the washing of the hands, for example.
Yeah, when he said that it doesn't matter what a man, that nothing that a man takes into his mouth can defile him. It's only the things that come out of his mouth. Because Jesus obviously didn't understand anything about nutrition. He didn't understand anything about poison. He's saying that the things that come, you don't need to wash your hands before you eat, which the Jewish tradition. He said, he told his people not to wash their hands because it doesn't matter what a man takes into his mouth. He said
what
that
comes out, what comes out.
Right. It's the words that come out of your mouth.
So was he talking about hygiene and biology, or was he talking about,
he believed that
he was talking about spirituality?
He believed that diseases were caused by demons.
Look, no, he didn't. Look, here's something I've always had trouble with.
Cast out demons.
If I always had trouble with this, if Jesus Christ came to earth and was God, why didn't he just tell us all the truth there was to know about science?
Why didn't he tell us some truth?
Anything.
Why is it that everything Jesus knows is limited to slightly less than the scholars of his day already knew?
Because the answer is because his mission was not to do that. His mission was to tell us how to live. And that message, and you can't deny this, that message of loving people, loving your enemies, was so revolutionary, we can't do it today.
Wait, so you will not deliver this message to the Gentiles? I come here only for the Jews? And the Canaanites are dogs? These are the messages from Jesus.
You're taking these words way out of context.
Well, like I said, there's so many problems with Christianity and with the flaws in the Christ character and everything going against the mission that what he does is actually opposite of what people says he does. You know, there's too much wrong with the Christianity thing. The purpose of our conversation was to see scientific reasons for belief in the supernatural or for a God. We're never going to get to Christianity for the reasons I've already pointed out.
Okay, so let's go back to that. Now, that's the title you put, and I don't know if you saw my tweet, but I never said that I came to Christianity, to God, believing in God, because of science. What science did for me was break the strong atheist view. And then coming to belief in God, which required a belief in Christ, came through other means, not through science. I don't see any way for science to address the issue in any sense of God's existence or non-existence.
Okay.
So I would not make that title was a little bit off from what I believe.
Well, just for full disclosure, I mean, the reason that I posted that was because, as I said, the reason you were tagged in that message was.
I remember that, right?
So I'm not going to say that you were saying something that you didn't say. I don't want.
And I would like to say one thing to you, Aaron, which has to do with your views, which I've listened to some of your talks and heard some of your interviews and of course read your tweets. And what disturbs me is not that you're an atheist, because that's fine. I was an atheist Most of my best friends are atheists because I'm a scientist. There are very few Christians. But what disturbs me is your sense of certainty that atheism is true. And because as we were just saying, certainty is not a good way to think about truth.
Okay, look, if we can clarify.
Okay.
The very sentence, certainty that atheism is true. How do you even say a sentence that atheism is true? I don't say that atheism is true. Okay, we've agreed. Then you've already just said you don't have scientific evidence to indicate God.
Right.
I agree. There, are we not? Are we both certain of that? Are you certain of what you've just said?
I'm certain.
I'm happy.
I'm certain that we don't have scientific evidence for or against God. But that's
okay,
not.
So you're going to criticize me for having certainty in the thing you just said.
No.
Okay.
Here's why. No.
Which certainty? Which certainty is it that you have a problem with then?
The fact that you're equating all epistemology with scientific evidence. In other words, you're saying if we don't have scientific evidence for God, it means there's no evidence for God, which means God does not exist.
Did I imply that in any of my talks or anything that you've ever read or seen?
If we don't have evidence for God, what didn't you just say it now?
Yeah, you gave a statement with some certainty that there is no evidence for God. Now, for me,
right.
the only good reason that we could have for believing in God would be evidence. Absent that,
what kind of evidence? What kind of evidence? That's the question.
Anything that qualifies as evidence, anything that is objectively verifiable, factual, and it positively indicative of, or exclusively concordant with one particular conclusion over any other.
And that does not include subjective experiences of any kind.
Of course not, because subjective experiences. You mentioned that you had some paranormal experiences or spiritual experiences. A lot of people do. A lot of people tell me that they have these spiritual experiences. Well, I did too. And not just in my stage as a reborn Christian. I did that, and then afterward, I didn't go immediately to a skepticism. I wish that I did. No, I went through this hugely embarrassing period of neo-pagan spiritualism, where I was practicing different types of meditation, and I realized there's so many different ways to enhance the mind, just meditationally, where you can perceive things that aren't there, and that's what faith is convincing yourself of things that aren't even real.
So let me ask you about this. I had a conversation with an atheist online a while ago, talking about this issue, and I said to him, there's no objective, verifiable scientific way to determine the value, the worth, the quality of the work of art. And he said, that's not true. You can do that. I asked him how. He said, just if you want to compare two pieces of art and see which one is better, just look at the market value, how much one costs versus the other. That was my reaction, Aaron. That was exactly my reaction. And I said, you're not serious, right? And he said, no, I'm serious. That's a quantitative measure. I
don't want to defend things stupid people say.
but the point is that there are many areas of life where scientific, objective, verifiable evidence does not apply. I just gave one example.
Now, I can state with full confidence that metal is the best music, but I don't have a way of proving that. Yeah, but what I was saying is, I've had spiritual experiences. I've had very profound spiritual experiences, and I believe Christians will come and tell me their weird stories about the things that they've seen or heard or whatever, and none of them ever approach what I've experienced, what I remember happening, what I remember seeing. My experiences were always more profound than any of theirs. But I had to go through this painful realization at some point that I had this huge epiphany that, I thought that I was basing everything, that I had evidence for the things that I believed. The whole reason that I bought into this neo-pagan spiritualism thing was because I grew up in Southern California, Los Angeles area in, like 1970. Just imagine, I'm a little kid in Los Angeles. And so all of the woo that you get from that hippie
Yeah.
culture in that time and place, in particularly in Los Angeles. You know, there was no more, you know, supernatural chakra crap than there was in Los Angeles. And then they used to show these science documentaries where they would, and it was completely bogus. I had no idea as a little boy that I'm watching nonsense. I think I'm watching a science documentary. And so they show things like Kirlian photography, where they have
Right.
they have proof of, you can take photographs of life force. I thought that parapsychology was an actual field of science, you know, in 1974 when I'm 12 years old.
Right.
So when I grow up, eventually, you know, I get on the internet, you know, and I start wondering, hey, you know, I haven't heard anything about Kirlian photography in, like, you know, so many decades. So let me go see what the latest breakthroughs are or whatever. And very quickly, I happened across the thing from the show that I saw that on. It was on In Search Of, was what it was called, and it was hosted by Leonard Nimoy.
I remember it.
Putting Leonard Nimoy on that show as the host was especially critical, because everything he said sounded logical. Because of course he's Spock. The first thing that I find is, I find this thing for the writers of In Search Of, well, I'm trying to look up the Kirlian photography stuff where and see where the breakthroughs are, and I'm so embarrassed that I'm an adult when I finally come to this realization. I see that where the writers admit, and even Leonard Nimoy himself admits, that they made up all of this stuff for purely entertainment purposes. And so I realized that I've based my belief system, I thought I had scientific evidence for, and this was the last straw. I believed in all kinds of stuff. I believed in the extraterrestrial aliens. I believed in the theory of Atlantis, in Bigfoot. When I was a teenager, I bought into all of it. And then one by one, by, you know, telekinesis, telepathy, teleportation, astral projection, all of these sorts of things.
Interesting.
And I thought I'd seen, you know, where you see the things with where the Russians, it's always on the other side of the Iron Curtain or someplace where you can't verify, but, you know, they're moving their hands, and you see the ball bearings move around because they're changing their magnetic waves. And, oh, that's fascinating that the human mind can do that. No, I'm just stupid and gullible as a kid. And so I finally realized that there was nothing, that all of the things that I've been told to believe, all of the spiritual things, all of the supernatural things, there was no value to it at all. There was no substance to it. And then I had to realize, I remembered all these things. I remember these visions that I had, not just, you know, not drug induced things. I'm saying I'm seeing and hearing things from a sober mind, in meditation and everything. I'm witnessing paranormal experiences, encounters with ghosts or what have you. I don't want to go into the details because, as I said, it's embarrassing. But I had to come to the very painful realization that none of that actually happened, because it couldn't have happened.
So let me break in and say something that you won't like, but it's kind of historically important. Christianity is actually the enemy of magic. Now, I know that most atheists think of Christianity and God and theism as magic.
Casting
but in fact,
out demons,
yeah,
bringing
exactly.
people back from necromancy, bringing people back from the dead. So yeah, that's magic.
No, but you see, the point is, there's a difference between magic and theology, and that is that magic has no central theme. It's arbitrary. It's what ruled the ancient world. People thought, well, there are demons and imps who by themselves have these ideas. They want to do things. They do them. We have no control. Christianity did not take that view. And in fact, you've heard this before, and I know you don't like it, but Christianity is what made science possible, because the Christian view, as articulated by all the early scientists all the way up to the end of the 19th century, was that this is a lawful, rational universe to some extent that was created by God to be lawful, and therefore magic doesn't work. Instead, there are rules and laws of science that we apply to. It has been stated that science actually got started as a result of the Christian view of the universe, which was opposed to the pagan, everything you're describing, the New Agey, the magic stuff, which has no explanation whatsoever. It's just wooey stuff that happens. The difference was that the Christians were able to say, God created the world, the moon, the suns, the stars, and put them in motion, and we should be able to understand the logic, the meaning of how that works, and they did.
Okay,
And if
it's also been said that science began centuries before the time of Jesus with the Ionian Greeks on the same realization that the universe is according to, the conditions or constants that are knowable.
Well, yeah, I mean, there were some people who said that, but the idea of experiment,
but Jesus is still casting out demons and raising the dead and telling people that if you just believe hard enough, then you can tell that mountain to jump into the sea. And any of my disciples will be able to do greater miracles than I have done. You just gotta make believe.
Okay, so why is that not a contradiction from what I just said? I mean, I believe in the miracles that are in the New Testament, including the resurrection, which is certainly a miracle.
You're trying to dispel the magic that clearly you didn't eliminate. I mean, the magic.
No. What I'm saying is that there is one exception to the anti-magic rule in Christianity, and that is God. Because God is the creator of the universe and can do pretty much anything that he wants to do, including incarnate himself, rise from the dead, do all the miracles that are in the New Testament, and that is a cohesive idea. So it's still magical, I grant you, but it comes from one source. It doesn't come from this, whims.
And there's still an exception to your exception, in that it's not God doing it, because Jesus does it and says that God is doing greater things than he is. So Jesus has distinguished himself from God, and then tells his disciples that they don't have to be him either. They can do it too. They just got to believe.
And they did do miracles.
So what we're talking about is a first century faith healer who is no more credible than any faith healer we have today.
Well, that's a matter of opinion.
Well, that's how I read it. I read the Gospels. I get a faith healer. I get somebody who is lying to people to get their money. I get somebody who tells them that a rich man will never get into heaven, that you have to give all your money to me because I'll give it to the poor, just like Bobby Tilton and his fake orphanage that doesn't really exist in Haiti. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about a faith healer.
I think what I get, I think I'm getting the sense, which does not surprise me, because I got this sense even when I was listening to some of your talks, that I'm not surprised that you had spiritual experiences of some kind. Because I think you're actually a very spiritual person. And I think that I know for my case, that troubled the hell out of me. I mean, I was not happy with that idea. I felt that it was a bad thing to be. I had to learn to get to the point where I could live with that and accept it before I could even go any further. And just casting it out, this is impossible, it can't be. It's a little bit like being a denialist, if you think about it. It's a little bit like being a conspiracy. I don't want to call you a conspiracy theorist, but it's not just that you reject the idea that Christ was God or that Christ was resurrected. You try to show that there's no evidence that Christ ever existed, and there's plenty of evidence to show.
There is not plenty of evidence that Christ existed. That's just to correct you before you even make that mistake. But I'm not trying to show you that there is not. The statement that I make is that in my perspective on mythicism is that we have a character that is compiled of too many other people, and that biblical scholars are saying that there are too many other people on this, and even the second century apologists are already attributing Jesus to other people. And I'm convinced, for the reasons that I've already talked to. I mean, I've talked to an awful lot of the scholars. I've done an awful lot of reading on this over the last 20 years of being an activist in this area. And what I've got is that this character, if you had a time machine, you would never be able to find that Jesus. You might be able you might be able to find one of the three main ones, but you wouldn't be able to bring all three of them back forward in time and have them recognize themselves in any of the movies about Jesus.
I actually agree with that. In fact, I was going to bring it up. I saw your, I don't remember where you did, but you had this whole story about the time machine, if you could go back and you could see. And I think that if we could do that, if we could go back to 30 AD and we went to Palestine and we saw this guy preaching, we would be surprised. There would be a lot of stuff that's not in the Gospels, and maybe some stuff that's in the Gospels, we wouldn't see any evidence of. But I'm pretty sure we would see him walking around preaching his message. And I'm also sure, because I'm a believer, that if we really got to the right place at the right time, we would see the stone rolled back and the tomb empty.
Okay. Well,
and we might see that there were 2 women rather than 3 women, or that there might be, this person instead of that person. The Gospels might have gotten it wrong in a lot of ways, but I think the basic stuff is there. And
I had a conversation in Christian forums with a couple of believers about this, and I had to screenshot what they said because I thought it was so amazing. If you had a time machine and you could go back and actually find Jesus, which I don't think is possible, but let's say you could find Jesus, and now we've got people saying that the Mark and Passion narrative isn't even that Jesus, that it's actually a different Jesus, that it's Jesus of I can't remember his name now, but there was a different Jesus that was being crucified, and maybe they got the story confused. And then Luke comes in and tells the same story that Josephus tells, and they seem to be talking about from the same event from different perspectives. And then that gets mixed in with the Mark and Passion narrative, and then we get this whole story glommed together, so that none of that really happened. Is what I'm.
No. What that shows is it probably happened, because that's exactly what you would expect from
what it shows is
an unwritten historical culture. People that they didn't have email.
If Josephus wrote both of those accounts, or if Luke wrote one about Josephus because they lived at the same time, and then Josephus wrote the one that ended up in Mark, then we're talking about something that happened 30 years too late. And then we have another thing. We have the apologists living at about the same time who are saying that Jesus lived centuries earlier. As opposed to a generation ago. He lived before Dionysus and before Hercules and before any of these other gods. Jesus is way before all of them. So how could that be? If the guy's only a generation after Jesus, why would he believe that? So there's too many huge problems with this. I don't want to be absolute. I certainly don't want to be unreasonable ever.
Okay.
I'm just saying that here's my position on it. There are a lot of consistencies here. We could argue the theology and the failures of Christianity forever. I don't want this show to be about that.
I agree.
I wanted this show to be what changed your mind as a scientist, and so we're just not even going to cover that. But when I asked believers, like, if you could go back in time and you could find this guy and see, and you recognize Jesus now, and you see him die and never get up. You can watch his body rot for a week and never revive. Would you change your mind? And the answer from both of them was no. That they hoped they still had the faith to keep believing even when their eyes tell them otherwise.
No, I don't agree with that. I believe in the reality and the truth of Christ's death and reresurrection. And
again, we can't use the word truth.
Well, I believe we can't. Yeah. You're right, but I believe that is a reality. If I could see that was not true, if that were possible, no, I would not continue.
Okay, well, that's good to hear, because that therein lies my problem. I mean, it seemed that you were telling me that you're criticizing my certainty. I'm certain about very specific things, and my mind is open to any possibility. But you have to show me that the possibility at least exists, or is there something to consider?
As you said, we shouldn't talk about the theology, but I find and I don't know enough of the history, or certainly of that period, to be able to make a clear case one way or the other. But I do know that there are some people, like, for example, Richard Carrier, who makes such a strong case where everything fits together so well that I don't believe it. And that goes back to what I said before about the guy who gave the seminar. When somebody has an explanation where everything fits and where there's no missing stones, there's no missing pieces, you have to wonder, is this really true, or is this an advertisement? Is this an advocate? Or is this someone really interested in the truth? And my view on listening to him is the answer is no. I see him as a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, and I'm very cautious about sensationalism.
Mhm.
While
agree.
I
I
am
see that.
certain of the things that I can show, I mean, I'm not going to back down from that. If I know it and I
Mhm.
can show it, then I'm going to say I
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, I understand. I respect that.
Okay, but I, I may have a
And
strong position on this, but I'm not going to be unreasonable about it. And I also don't want to. I think we've reached a point where we're going to end up repeating each other.
yeah,
So,
and also I'm looking at the time, and
yeah,
I'm
I want to
running.
thank you for your time here and for your explanation. And because we are running low on time, I'm going to let you go ahead and close out. Say what you
Oh,
want.
okay. Okay. Well, the reason I wanted to talk to you was, first of all, as I said, when you asked me if I would come on this thing, whatever, this channel, I had already seen a lot of your tweets, and I was very intrigued by the way you think. And I thought it would be interesting to share my own views with you, and I think it has been. I'm glad I did. The other reason that I'm interested in doing this is I think it's important within Christianity for people to understand that there are different ways of looking at the Christ story, the God story, evolution, science, and that it should be possible. And this, I'm not speaking directly to you, but to anyone in the audience who might be a Christian or might be thinking about it or might be wavering, that it is not necessary to choose between science and religion. And a lot of people think it is, and that's not true. And it's not me. I mean, there's, Francis Collins, the head of NIH, and many other people. I've mentioned them on Twitter, who are scientists and believing Christians, and they're perfectly good scientists, much better than I am. And they're probably better Christians too. But this is important. To me, this is an important message to get out. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you hate evolution. Just because you believe in evolution doesn't mean you can't be a Christian, as an example. I strongly believe, and the most important thing that I think that I said today was that if God is the author of the universe, he is the author of everything we know from science. So there cannot be this anti-science attitude among Christians. And that's what I would like to have.
I'm glad you made that message, because I have the same opinion. We can end on a point of agreement.
Okay, I like that.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank
Aaron.
you very much. I'm going to go close it out.
Take care.